guys doing some classes like this, because really my passion is working with community organizations and parents and caregivers like yourselves. So it's great to hear from you. I know we have, most of our group is 5 and under their children. Is that right, Maggie?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so I just wanted to let you guys know before we get started that, like I said, you can put any questions in the chat and I will try to address them. I'll also have questions or stopping points throughout for questions so that we can make sure that we're kind of taking a break and I'm not doing just all the talking, because I would love to hear from you guys as well. So today we're going to be talking about understanding behavior, and there's a lot to unpack with that. So although it sounds simple, we're going to go through a lot of different things today. And it looks like you guys kind of already have the heads up on a lot of these things. You guys are all muted, so that's great. That helps with me being able to hear and everyone else being able to hear, so there's no echo. Again, write your questions in the chat. I will do my best to get to them. And if you have something really burning, I am totally okay with you interrupting me, so that's fine too. Just know I might be addressing it later and refer to it at the end, or you know, we might have to chat offline about something. And then again, we would love your feedback. We're always trying to improve. So I put a link to an evaluation, a pretty brief evaluation in the chat box. So we would really appreciate any feedback you have. All right. So the other thing I want to encourage is, if for whatever reason you guys can't hear me, please let me know. I gave a talk earlier today and I heard that my mic went out for some reason. So feel free to interrupt. Hey, we can't hear you. So these are the things we'll be talking about today. So we're going to be defining behavior, talking about what contributes to behavior. Really importantly, we'll be talking about the function of behavior. So why behavior occurs, the ABCs of behavior, which will make more sense once I get to that place, and some strategies to address behavior. And we'll ask for questions throughout and then have you guys do those evaluations at the end. And can I just get a thumbs up from you guys if you can see my screen okay? Awesome, all right. So behavior, what is it? It's really anything that can be observed, defined, and measured. So that could be me raising my hand. That could be you talking to a friend. So really, it's a broad category that encompasses a lot of different things. So it's really important, and we'll talk about this throughout, to be very specific with the behavior that you're addressing. So if you think of a tantrum, for instance, a tantrum could mean so many different things. To one parent or one caregiver, that might mean 5 minutes of screaming. To another, that might mean 20 minutes of yelling, kicking, screaming, hitting. And so it's really important that you be very specific about behavior so that we can know if it's changing, know where we need to go and what we need to address. And then if there's any improvements on along the way, we can know that as well. And importantly, behavior is really trying to communicate something. So it's a response oftentimes to what's going on in the environment. If you think of a baby, they're not thinking like, oh, I need to communicate that I'm hungry, or that I need fed, or that I need change, but it's just an innate response to something that they need, and that's how they're trying to communicate. Similar to the child here that's covering his ears, you can see he's trying to communicate something is overwhelming, whether it's a noise or I need like some calming. He's trying to communicate something as well. So when we think of behavior, we want to think about what is that communicating to us. And so I'm going to go through some common things that contribute to behavior. So there's several different contributors. So the first one is really looking at thinking differences. So we know with children with developmental disabilities often think in a little bit of a different way. They can be literal in how they think about things, like kind of concrete. Maybe they really like that repetition and the sameness, so they might want to do the same thing over and over. They might need more time to process information and respond, and they might need us to communicate a little bit different. So maybe steps to be broken up into smaller pieces and be very concrete. So instead of go get your shoes, your backpack, and meet me at the door, first go get your shoes and then wait till that's done until the next step. So we want to take into consideration thinking differences. And these are some tips when addressing thinking differences. And so I think this is a very timely conversation because I know with COVID, some parents might be staying home. And so I always think of parents and caregivers as their child's most important teacher. So if you think about that, that's kind of a big responsibility, right? And I know that a lot of you are doing actual teaching at home too. And so, we want to think about teaching to our child's learning style. So if you think about the most important teacher that you had in your life, or the one that you kind of recall as your favorite, think about what it was that made them your favorite. So for me, I think about my second grade teacher, Mrs. Poaches. So she was my favorite because she knew I was a super overactive kid that had a lot of energy. So I needed to get up and move. And so she really did a lot of things like having me run errands for her, giving me movement breaks so that I could really learn to the best of my ability. So, you want to try to be as predictable as possible when teaching your children. Try to be organized with how you're teaching them. Prepare them for things that are upcoming. Like that might be with, just a verbal warning. Or sometimes what can be really helpful is pairing some kind of verbal instruction with a visual cue of some kind. Whether that's literally like getting their backpack and saying we're going, so that they know like, okay, that object goes with me to a new place, or maybe some kind of visual support. And then there's also some things not to do, although I kind of like focusing on what we should do, and I'll talk more about why that is a little bit later. Try not to rush them. Try not to just rely on words, because we are a very verbal world, and I think we don't realize how much we rely on words and how much that doesn't accommodate all different types of learning styles. And then you want to take items of interest away when you're trying to teach them something, but integrate them in a way that they're getting that thing back when they do something that you want. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that later as well. All right. And then another contributor to behavioral difficulties is emotional differences. So we know that, children feel emotions differently. They have different insights about their emotions. And so really we want to think about helping them to understand their emotions so that it's not seeming like it goes from 0 to 100. Like it does often, right? You're like, I don't even know. They just got really, really upset and I'm not sure why. But a lot of times if we can help our children understand their emotions and label them and, talk about what they're feeling in their body or what they're thinking, oftentimes we can help understand when they're escalating, and so that things don't go from 0 to 100. So this is a great example of how to teach them about emotions. And this is just one example that's used for frustration, but it's showing the green where they're in the 1, that's feeling happy. What does that feel like in your body? What kind of thoughts are you having? What are you doing? And then all the way up to the 5, where they're getting really, really frustrated. Maybe they're really red in the face. Maybe they're throwing and kicking. And talking about the in-between too, and what's happening in between, so that they can start to identify like, oh, when I start to get kind of hot, I realize I'm getting frustrated or I'm getting mad. And so thinking about that and teaching them about their own emotions. This is another example of that system and how to teach that. So you can see here, I think this was on the left-hand side, they were at a 1. There was no worries. And this is pertaining to being fearful, and they're feeling fine. And you can see the 2 means they're starting to have some worries. And then the 5 is they're very scared. They're super worried. And so they were explaining what that's like in their body and the thoughts that they were having. And then there's biological factors as well that contribute.
Teresa, real quick, can I ask?
Absolutely.
Would there be ways to share those, like that scale or something? Like, is that like a printable or something that you could like email?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, that would be awesome.
I know that's a great scale, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'll just write that down so I don't forget. So there's also biological factors like I was talking about, and these can be sensory concerns. So maybe a child is, overly sensitive to certain senses. Like if things are too loud, maybe they get upset very easily. Maybe they don't like the way that certain clothing feels, for instance. But this can also be undersensitive. So maybe they have a really high tolerance for pain. And so when they do feel pain, it's much more intense, and their behavior is probably going to be a little bit different. So we want to consider those biological factors as well. And then I think, most importantly, the biggest contributor to behavior is difficulties with communication. Like I was saying before, we live in a really verbal world, and that can be really challenging for kids that don't always rely on that as their main form of communication or the easiest way for them to communicate. So this can include challenges with comprehension and maybe what we're saying. So again, like I was saying before, instead of giving multi-step directions, breaking it up into like one direction at a time so they can really comprehend, oh, I need to put my shoes away. Oh, and then I go get my backpack after that. So they have some time to process. I also think that we can be really confusing in the way that we talk about things. So we're not very concrete and direct in our language. Often we tell kids what not to do instead of what to do, which is kind of why I didn't like that slide of the things to avoid, because it's really confusing for a kid who maybe is already having a hard time comprehending verbal instructions to hear what not to do. Because if you think about it, they have to flip that in their head to realize what they need to be doing. So it's much easier if you just tell a kid what to do. So for instance, say they're running, you want to say, please use your walking feet. So they know exactly what to do instead of stop running, slow down, whatever it is. I think also we can be pretty vague in what we want our children to do. So, a lot of times you hear parents or caregivers or providers say like, play nice or be nice, be a good girl. And it's like, well, what does that mean? I'm not sure what that means. For me, that might mean one thing. And I think about my brother-in-law that teases me all the time, and that's probably going to mean something very different to him when it comes to being nice. So we want to be very direct. So instead of saying be nice, use nice words or use nice hands, play nicely with your hands, whatever it may be, so that they understand exactly what it is that we're trying to communicate. And again, there's some do's for this. So again, keep it simple, speak slowly, allow for time, be very specific about what you want, repeat, and say it a little bit differently if needed. And I think one thing that a lot of us do, just because our society is so go, 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 is we don't take time to listen and wait. So just giving them that time to process and wait. And then visual supports can always be very helpful. So whether that's like an actual, picture of what you want them to do, or if you want them to get ready to go, maybe picking up something to them that cues that, like their backpack or their jacket, whatever it may be. And again, there's that what not to do. I feel like as adults, we can understand that a little bit more, but don't be like me and don't talk too fast. Don't talk too much. Try to not be vague in your language or talk over them. So communication is definitely a major contributor to difficult behavior. And so something that we always want to keep in mind. And when maybe we don't know how to communicate with our child, what is their behavior communicating to us? All right. All right, I want to stop there and see if anybody has any questions, and then we'll go into more of why does misbehavior happen?
I did see one question in the chat box.
Oh, great. So I have the pictures, this muted a little bit, so let me open it up. Maggie, would you mind reading off the question for me?
This one asks if you have any other scales and resources for other emotions.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would be happy to share those things. One thing that I have found really interesting in the social media world too is just like a tip is Pinterest has a lot of different things on it. So if you just Google like emotion chart, or sometimes emotion thermometers will give you a lot of really good visuals. So those are some places to go just to see if maybe you want to create your own, if you're looking for something special. So I know, for instance, my nephew does not like talking about emotions, but he really loves anything construction site. So dump trucks, excavators, whatever it may be. So my sister actually found an emotion thermometer that had those things on it. So it's much more motivating for him to engage in and talk about. But I'd be happy to provide more of those. Any other questions? And you guys can type them in the chat. But for some reason, I'm having a hard time looking at multiple windows. So also, if you just want to speak up and ask, that's okay too. And I'm going to practice what I preach and allow some time to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. All right. I'm going to keep moving on then, because I'm sure there'll be more and more questions as we go. So next, we're going to talk about the functions of behavior.
One did pop up.
Sure.
It says, how do you recommend we communicate this to caregivers of our children?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I think such an important question, because you absolutely want to be on the same page as your caregivers with your children. Sometimes that's a little bit harder. I think the best way to do that is provide them with some data about your children's behavior and what that means, and maybe what it is that they're trying to communicate. And we can talk a little bit more about how we get that data and how we track that later. And that is called an ABC chart. And so that might be one way for you to communicate about your child's behavior. I also think just understanding what we're going to talk about next and the functions of behavior is really helpful to discuss and be on the same page with providers about. So as we go through this presentation, I'll come up with some more ideas about how to communicate that with their caregivers. But I want to move on to the functions of behavior, because that is really the key to understanding behavior. The function is why we do a behavior. So it is the purpose behind the behavior, and that does not change. So if we are looking for attention, we're going to try to get attention, whether that is negative attention or positive attention. And so this is really the key to unlocking behavior, because if you know what your child wants, if you know what the function of their behavior is, you can give that to them if they do what you want. So if they demonstrate appropriate skills instead of a problem behavior. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process as we go on. I'm going to give some examples of what functions of behavior are before we talk about the process of addressing them. So, again, this is the key to change and why behavior occurs. It can be for attention. It can be for a tangible reason. So that's like to get something. It can be to escape a situation, or for sensory stimulation or biological medical factors. And I'll go over each one of those in more detail. So the first one I like to start off with is attention. And that is because about 80% of human behavior occurs to serve the function of attention. So to get attention. So if you're not really sure why a behavior is occurring and what the function is, a really safe place to start is to assume that it's for attention. And if that doesn't work, then you can kind of eliminate from there. But again, kids are gonna, if they want attention, they're gonna do that if it's positive attention, whether that's getting praise or compliments, or if it's negative attention. So I love to use my nephew in examples because he is hilarious and may have said a couple or overheard a couple curse words or two from my sister. And so he will repeat those because he knows that gets him attention. Sometimes it's laughing, unfortunately, even though we try not to laugh, it's very hard. But sometimes it's like, no, don't say that, you know, and it instantly gets him attention. But he's doing that so that he can serve that function to get the attention. And then there's tangible functions, which again is just, that is like to get something. So maybe you want a snack or a certain toy, or maybe you want to do something like going to the park or being on the iPad. So this is an example of this is you've probably seen a child having a tantrum in a grocery store checkout line because they want those goodies that are in that line, right? They want the M&Ms, or for me, the Reese's, whatever it may be. And so they tantrum to try to get that thing. And a lot of times, and understandably so, that can be an embarrassing situation for parents. So they will give in and give them that candy or whatever it is that they want. And so for that child, that reinforces that tantrum. Like, oh, I wanted the candy bar and I tantrumed and then I got it, so that works. And they're going to be more likely to do that again in the future. And so I'm delving a little bit into what happens after the behavior, which is what we call a consequence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The third function of behavior is escape. And so this could be escape for a variety of different reasons. It could be maybe you're in a situation where you're feeling uncomfortable, like anxious, and so you want to get away from that situation. It could be maybe you don't want to do homework or chores that you have to do. A lot of times for kids with autism spectrum disorder, what we see is they have sensory sensitivities, like loud noises, for instance. And so they'll want to escape a situation where it's like very loud. And maybe they'll do that by having a tantrum or covering their ears, whatever it may be. But this is a way to get away from something that's unpleasant. And then the fourth function of behavior is sensory or biological or medical concerns. So if you think about adults, you know, like when we have a headache or a stomach ache, we're not functioning at our full capacity. And for us, we can kind of abstractly understand that that's impacting us and going to change the way we feel, and we can kind of talk ourselves through that. But for children, that's a lot harder. That's a very abstract process. And so they might act out if they have a headache or stomach ache or if they're tired. And then also the sensory piece is really important because it is really hard to address sensory seeking behaviors, because if you think about it, when we have an itch, how hard is it not to scratch that itch, right? Because as soon as we scratch it, it is so relieving. It's so gratifying for us. And so that is the same with sensory behaviors. So this might be a child that like rocks back and forth or flaps their hands, for instance. And that they do that because it feels really good to them. And so those behaviors are a little bit harder to address and require a little bit more creativity. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So as you can see, I'm kind of just like building the foundation for you guys of behavior, and then we'll get more into addressing certain behaviors a little bit later. But again, I want to stop in between and see if there's any questions, anything that is confusing, anything that you're like listening to and you're like, wow, that really is my kid, or I've seen that happen before.
Hi, can you touch on more? I saw that tip that you wrote about if you see behavior that happens like all of the sudden or out of nowhere on the last slide. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure.
I don't know. It might be, we couldn't read the rest of it. So it was hidden with the picture. So I don't know if, yeah, the tip right there.
Yeah, so this is saying like if a behavior comes out of nowhere and it's not typical of your child, and it, especially if it's happening during like a time where they're usually behaving pretty well, or something that they really enjoy, and they're getting upset out of nowhere and it's very confusing to you, that might be a way that they're communicating to you that something's wrong with them internally. Like maybe they're not feeling good. Maybe their stomach is really upset.
Okay.
So all that's saying is like tapping into that medical piece. Like maybe there's something going on with their body that they can't understand, and that's their way of communicating it.
Okay.
Yep. Great
Okay.
question. Absolutely.
Another question came up. It says, can there be multiple factors contributing to the same behavior?
I like the way that you're thinking. Absolutely. And typically there is. So what you want to think about when you're thinking about the function is, what is the thing that is most motivating to that child in the moment? So like for my nephew, for instance, when he curses, he's doing that just to get attention, and that is what is really motivating for him. So while there can be multiple different functions going on at once, typically there's one that's really causing the behavior to happen and that is really motivating for them. And you find that out by breaking it down and collecting data on the behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So figuring out what's happening before the behavior, what the behavior actually is, and then what's happening after. And when you break it down and get really specific, it's easier to identify the function. Just want to check in and make sure everyone can still see the slides okay and hear me okay. Just a brief thumbs up. All right. So now we're going to talk about, so we know what behavior is, we know why it's happening. It could be for multiple different reasons, but how do we change the behavior? And the first step to that, which I've already alluded to a little bit, is observing the behavior and describing it. So you do that by taking data on the behavior. And we want to be really specific about what the behavior is. So if you look at this list of behaviors, you know, aggression, for instance, can mean something so different for every child and in every situation. So we want to be really specific about what the aggression is. He was hitting me in the face for 5 minutes. That's really different than like hitting somebody on the shoulder or the arm, you know, than hitting someone in the face. And so again, we want to be really specific about what the behavior is so we know how to address it, and so we know how to change it. Let's see, I want to make sure that hitting all the points on this slide. So again, really the purpose of being very specific about the behavior is so that you can measure it. So you want to think about like, how long did it occur? What was actually happening? What were they doing or saying? How intense was that? So again, was it like hitting, biting, and screaming really hard, or was it just kind of like pinching? Like what did that behavior look like? And describing it and being very specific. And then we're gonna, again, talk about the function of the behavior. And I alluded to our ABC model, which is really highlights the function of the behavior. So the A stands for the antecedent. The antecedent is anything that's happening before the behavior. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then the behavior is the B. And then the C is the consequence, or what happens immediately after the behavior. And sometimes this can be confusing because people think consequence and they think like punishment, but really it's just whatever happens after the behavior. So it could be something positive. Maybe after this talk, one of you guys sends me a nice email, and that, for me, that behavior is reinforced. Like I want to do more of these because I get a nice email from someone. It could also be your child has to go to timeout. So it could be a punishment, and that kind of affects whether or not they're going to do the behavior in the future. But when you're thinking of behavior, it always happens in this linear process. So when we're taking data on the behavior, we want to think about what is happening before, what the actual behavior was, and then what happened afterwards. And sometimes there can be several different ABC chains happening at once. And so it's really important to kind of take a step back and try to break it down. So the antecedent, again, is what's happening before the behavior. Some examples of these include like environmental conditions. So if you're in a noisy place, or maybe you're in a place that's really hot or crowded, it can also include like the activity that you're doing. So I remember for me, I was much more likely as a kid to act up when I had to do math type assignments. I hated math. That was so hard for me. And so, you know, thinking about that task, I was more likely to have disruptive behavior. This could also be schedule. So if you think about time of day, I'm sure some of us are much better once we've had our cup of coffee and get going in the morning, as opposed to like when we first wake up. And the same is true for children. This can also be physical states. So are you hungry? Are you feeling tired? Children have a harder time communicating and addressing those things, and so that can also contribute to behavior. It can also be who you're with. My sister loves to say that my nephew acts very different around me than he does her. And I think that's because he knows, you know, mama is my comfort place, and I can act any kind of way with her and she's still going to love me. Where with me, he feels like he has to be on better behavior. I'm not always around. And I'm sure a lot of you parents and caregivers experience that too, where maybe your child acts up with you. Or it could be maybe your child acts up in a situation where they don't feel comfortable. Like maybe they don't feel comfortable at school for whatever reason, or with a certain caregiver. And so that's where you see more of the acting up. So it can be who they're with as well. So antecedents are really helpful to let us know like if a behavior is going to happen, and we can talk about some strategies later about how to address them. While antecedent strategies are really helpful, the most powerful part of that ABC chain is the consequence. And that's because consequences tell us, I don't know why this keeps highlighting, sorry, you know, whether or not we're going to do that behavior again in the future. So if I give my nephew a dump truck after he does something good, he's going to be much more likely to continue to do that behavior because he loves everything construction. if he has to go to timeout after he does something, he's going to be much less likely to do that behavior in the future because he had to go to timeout. So the consequence is the most powerful because it directly influences whether or not the behavior is going to occur in the future. So these are some really great examples, like a father saying, "Great work. Oh, that's so motivating for me. I want to do that again. Like, I want to please dad." Or a teacher letting a child have a 5-minute break. A grandmother telling a child to stop, or being ignored, for instance. And so what's interesting about those different consequences is depending on the function of the behavior, they are either going to increase the likelihood that they're going to do that behavior in the future or decrease it. So if you think about the last example, the mother ignoring the child by turning away, say the child's function was attention, and then the mother ignores them. They're going to be much less likely to do whatever behavior they were doing because they didn't get their what they wanted. They didn't get that attention. So say they're yelling and screaming to get their mom's attention and she's just ignoring them, acting calmly. They're going to be less likely to do that next time to get her attention because it didn't serve that function. It didn't get that attention for them. But on the opposite end, if the function of the behavior was to escape a situation, maybe mom is sitting there with homework and they're trying to get out of it and she just ignores them when they're trying to get out of it, then that is going to be really reinforcing for that child. So you want to, again, think about the function of the behavior because that really determines what consequence you want to use and how you address that behavior.
There was a question that popped up on that. She said, is that true for any age, whether the child can rationalize or not?
That's such a good question. And is that thinking about like the consequence of the behavior and it having to meet the function, or what is?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, because like my daughter, she'll pinch or she'll pull her sister's hair. And it's an automatic, no, don't do that. But I don't know, but she smiles when she does it. So part of me wants to say that she knows what she's doing is wrong, but deep down, does she really understand I'm doing this behavior, this function, and this is the result? I don't know if the rationale, if she can rationalize it or not.
Yeah, so I think you bring up such an important topic and one that I actually didn't have plans to touch on in this, but really when we're talking about behavior can become more complex as your thinking skills become more complex. But this ABC chain and how behavior works is the same for a child that is 5 as it is for me as an adult that is, I won't say my age, but not 5. And so really this social, it's like a social learning theory, and it applies across all ages. Now that's not to say as children get older, they don't understand a little bit more about this process and how maybe to manipulate certain parts of it. And so you have to get a little bit more creative. But in the instance where you're talking about, it sounds like if she is looking and smiling at you, that might be I'm curious what you think. What do you think the function of that behavior might be?
I think the function is to get the attention, I think
Yeah.
that's what I think that's pure. And it's usually, thinking about it, it's usually in the evening after, a long day, she might be getting tired. But I think it's the attention is what she's looking for.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know the exact situation, so it's hard to say for sure, but it definitely sounds like if she is looking at you like, oh, I'm going to do this, and then does it and smiles, that sounds like it's very much for attention. Mm-hmm. So if you think about what you did afterwards, where you say, no, don't do that, do you think that is meeting the function of her behavior to get that attention or not?
Probably not, no, I don't think so.
So when we're thinking about attention, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative attention, any kind of attention is attention. Mm-hmm. Yep. So it likely is actually, meeting her goal to get the attention because you looked at her, you said something to her. So although it wasn't like positive attention necessarily, it was attention. And so right. She knows, oh, if I do this and look at mom and pinch my sister, I can get attention. And so she's going to be more likely to do that behavior in the future to get your attention.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, that's such a hard one, because when the behavior potentially could be causing harm or
Right.
something, so it's like, how do you ignore that?
So, and unfortunately, that's where you draw the line, right? So if someone is going to be hurt or the behavior is destructive and that it's going to damage property or something like that, you unfortunately cannot ignore that. And so you do end up reinforcing that behavior, because that is where you draw the line. You don't want somebody to get hurt. You don't want things to get ruined. But there are a lot of things that we'll talk about that you can do to make that more clear to them, the kind of attention, or what will get your attention and what won't. So if she was kind of just like being silly and pinching her sister, but it wasn't hard or hurting her, you know, that might be one thing. But if she's really digging in and hurting her sister and she's like crying, that's a whole nother thing. And you do have to intervene, right? And so I think you make a really great point, Maggie. There are a lot of things that you can do with attention, though, to let them know like the positive behaviors that you want to see that will get your attention. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Great questions and
Thank
comments.
you.
Absolutely. So this is just an example of an ABC chain. So there's a couple here. You see there's the antecedent is the first column. So, you know, in the first example, the parent drives past the McDonald's on the way home from school. And the second column is the behavior. Eric hits his head on the seat and yells, "I want nuggets." And then the last column is the consequence. So the parent turns around and goes to McDonald's to get the nuggets. So in that example, what was the function of Eric's behavior? And anyone can just yell it out. So remember we had for attention, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the tangible.
Yes, he wanted to get those nuggets, right? And his behavior was yelling and screaming to get the nuggets. So when he did that, was the function of his behavior met? Like, did he get the thing that he wanted? Yeah. So do you guys think that he's going to be more likely to yell and scream in the future when he wants nuggets again? Absolutely, right? So that reinforced that behavior. Let's see. So another example.
A question about that. Yeah. So I think, like, you know, my kids might ask, like, or not ask, like they say, like, "I want this," or I don't know, just like rudely, or maybe they yell or something like that. And I say, "No, you need to ask nicely if you want the sucker, like say please." But, you know, like so then they repeat and they say please, and I give it to them, but I'm like, I don't know. Do you know what I'm like getting at? Like they still acted inappropriately because they wanted something. And if I did give it to them,
yep.
I don't know. That's confusing.
It is so confusing, Maggie, and it's something that a lot of parents struggle with. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're getting at is like you want to kind of teach by principle. Like you're trying to teach your kids a principle. Like they shouldn't talk to you like that when they want something, right? So, and a lot of parents think of discipline that way. Like I'm trying to instill these values in you and I want to teach you like my principles and act the way that I expect you to act. But children don't necessarily think that abstractly and they don't understand that. So what you were doing in that situation, and kind of what I like to reframe a lot of parents with discipline, is not so much thinking about teaching it with principle, but teaching your children the skills that you want them to have and the appropriate behavior that you want them to have. And in that situation, Maggie, you did that. There are a couple things that maybe you could have helped. So a lot of times you want to create space between the problem behavior.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so you want to create space between the problem behavior and, in this case, the replacement behavior. So the problem behavior was asking for something rudely. You wanted them to do the replacement behavior, which was asking nicely, right? So just thinking about how you can create time in between those things, but I think actually what you did is exactly right. because you taught them, oh, you get the sucker when you ask nicely, right? And so you were teaching them that skill.
Yeah,
And
so I'm just, yeah, I was like looking, you know, like he drives by McDonald's and wants nugget. He yells because he wants nuggets, and he turns around and gets it. But had he turned around and say, well, if you ask nicely, or if you know, like nicely, then do you still turn around and go give them the nuggets, or do you just say, no, you don't get the nuggets? Like, that's, you know, I guess that's.
yeah, so I think it's such a fine line. And it's also considering where your specific child is at. If it is something where they are like constantly yelling and screaming every time they want something, you absolutely don't want to give that to them when they say it nicely just because you asked, right? So you want to create enough space so that they know that the yelling and screaming isn't what's getting them the nuggets, it's asking nicely. And if the child is having a lot of difficulties with asking nicely, and that's not something they do very often, I would not go back just because they asked nicely, because then they're going to be like, oh, you know, I asked nicely, but first I was yelling and screaming. So that's really what they're going to be thinking about. So that's a really good question. Does that answer your question? I know it's kind of vague.
Yeah, no, I think the spacing makes sense. Like, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I love you using my nephew as an example, but we went to the Cincinnati Zoo recently. And he was throwing a fit because he wanted to, we were going to leave and he didn't want to leave. And so he was throwing a fit. So we said, no, you're throwing a fit, we leave, right? So what we did is we took him out to the car and we let him calm. And we said, okay, once you calm, we can go back into the zoo for X amount of minutes. So it's creating space between that problem behavior and the replacement behavior. So you can see that there was an ABC chain for him where the antecedent was, you know, he had to leave the zoo, he didn't want to, he was getting tired, the behavior was yelling and screaming, and the consequence right after that behavior was going to the car. So he associates yelling and screaming with going to the car, and then calming with being able to go back into the zoo. So that's kind of an example. It's tricky though, and you do have to get kind of creative, and it is a case-by-case basis for sure, and thinking about the kid and where they're at with their behavior. I want to keep going, so I make sure that we get through all the slides. But you guys have great questions, so I would encourage you to keep asking and keep engaged, because it's been really helping me think through some of these things as well. So we're going to talk about antecedent strategies, so kind of anticipating challenging behaviors before they arise. The one thing I will say about antecedent strategies is they are wonderful and they can absolutely help problem behavior. However, they take a lot of work on the parent end or the caregiver end or the provider, whoever it is. And they're not the most powerful part of the ABC chain. So remember, the most powerful part of the ABC chain is the consequence. And that is what tells a child whether or not they're going to do that behavior again in the future. So it's important to have antecedent strategies and be able to plan ahead, but just know that sometimes that can only get you so far. And so not to be hard on yourself if they don't work, but keep doing them because they will be helpful. And we do a lot of these every day in our clinics. So again, it's just kind of thinking like one step ahead. Let's see. All right. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of freezing on my computer. All right. So some examples of some antecedent strategies that you could use are to alter the environment. So, you know, for a child that gets really distracted, for instance, this might be making sure that they sit maybe away from their peers or have like a cardboard cutout around them or board around them so they can't see everything that's going on around in their environment and getting distracted by objects in the room. This could also be, for instance, like for a child that's very active. Like I was saying, I was very active as a child. My teacher often let me get up and move around so that I could return to that environment in a better, more teachable way. And then you want to keep the environment structured. So, you know, provide time that's structured and they're doing a certain thing. But if you think about it, we all need a break, right? Like, what if we were just working all day long with no breaks or sense of like freedom or being able to do what we want? That's really hard. So making sure that you're balancing the structure with some unstructured time as well. And I say unstructured because that could also be setting them up with something that you've thought about, maybe giving them a couple of different toys to choose from ahead of time, or setting them up with an iPad. So when I say unstructured, I just mean that it's kind of something that they're doing on their own with their own free will, but it could be activities that you've chosen. And then you want to provide a lot of opportunities for positive attention. So, you know, great job playing with those toys, or great job listening, whatever it may be. So that really, when you praise, it is a consequence in of itself, and it lets the child know, like, oh, that's a behavior that person likes to see, so I'm going to do that again. And then you always want to encourage functional communication. Like I was saying, a lot of behavior happens because it's children are having difficulties communicating, whether that's how they're feeling, needing help. So encouraging that from your child. So, you know, if they're getting upset and frustrated with something because it's not working, you know, encourage them to use your words or ask for help. Or if they need a break, like if they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, maybe they can use their words to ask for a break, or maybe they hold up a card to say they want a break. But teaching them some ways to communicate with you. And then we also want to plan for transitions. I know it can be really tough to transition for a lot of kids, especially away from a preferred activity. So a lot of times what I like to use is a visual timer, so they can see, you know, the time is going down and they're kind of aware of how much time that they have left. The one thing I will say is if you use a timer, whether it's for an activity that they need to do, like homework, or an activity that they're enjoying to do, like iPad time or whatever it is, when that timer goes off, you need to be prepared to transition as well. Because if you don't transition as soon as the timer goes off, that's really not going to mean anything to them. That timer becomes meaningless for them. These are some more examples of just being able to give your child an idea of what's coming ahead. I know that the age group that you guys of children that you have is a little bit younger, the 0 to 5, so this schedule wouldn't necessarily work for them, but you can do much more simple schedules for younger children to let them know what's coming up. For 0 to 5, we often do first then. I might have an example of that. Let me see. Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, but we'll often have first then, where it's maybe a picture of like an activity they have to do, like maybe they have to sit at dinner or something like that, and it's a picture of a child sitting at dinner, and then they get to go play. So maybe then children playing. So it's a way to let them know what's coming up, what's anticipated. Because if you think about it, even for us, like we don't just transition when a timer goes off. Like we don't just transition away from work when it's 5 o'clock, we're done, we pack up, we go. We transition away when we're kind of more ready, we're in a good place with what we have done for the day. And our children are really the same and kind of want that heads up as well, so they can start to prepare themselves for what's coming up. And then you want to be consistent with this, like I said, and follow through. So if the timer goes off, you go on to the next thing. If you did a first then board, they have to sit there and eat the dinner before they can go and play. So I've talked about these. A really good thing in providing your children with some autonomy and making them feel like they have some choices is providing them choices. So say there's an activity that's really hard for them. So for instance, with my nephew, leaving the zoo was really hard for him. So next time I take him, I might say, hey, we're getting ready to leave. Do you want to, take a piggyback on my back while we leave, or do you want me to hold your hand when we leave? So kind of making it like fun and giving them a choice. Again, using first then. So first we eat our dinner, then we go outside and play. So letting them know what to expect and what you want from them in order to get what they want. And then you want to, if a task is a little bit harder and you know that for them, so if waiting, for instance, is a little bit harder, you want to make sure that they're practicing that skill, but that you're modifying the amount of time and shortening the task when possible so that they can feel some real success with that. So say you're teaching your child to wait, and you just do it for maybe 1 minute at a time. And every time they wait for 1 minute, you're like, great job, that was so awesome. Thank you for waiting so nicely. And then you slowly increase it as they are able to do that more and more. And then using visual supports can be really helpful. Like I was talking about, we live in a super verbal world and our children aren't always as verbal. And oftentimes, we understand what we mean, but our children don't always. So pairing it with some kind of visual cue is really helpful. So this is an example of the first then board. So you can see here, first we do table work, then we play with toys. And it really helps children to know what they need to do and what's expected of them. And again, you want to consider the developmental level of the child. I know your children are a little bit younger, so you're not going to use something that's really complicated. But as your children get older, you can use things that are a little bit more complicated. So maybe you add in first, next, then, once they get the hang of the first then. But you want to start off really basic with your visuals so they can get the hang of it and understand what they mean, and then maybe increase the complexity as they age and they're understanding things a little bit more. I know one thing that some preschool classes are doing is like having some things that they do in the morning and having those activities up. And then once the morning's done, they'll have some things that they do in the afternoon. And so really thinking about it in tinier amounts of time so the child can really follow and understand. This is an example of a daily schedule, but as you can see, it's breaking it down into the nighttime schedule. So they're not having to think about their whole day, because that's a lot for a child that's younger, right? So they're just thinking about what they need to do at night. So they need to do dinner, bathtub, get dressed, brush their teeth, go to bed. And what's really nice is you can see here that for each of these things that they have to do, once they're done with that, they can choose one of the things below. So they can choose reading a book, or they can choose like listening to their iPad or tablet, whatever it may be. So again, giving them some choice can be nice too. It's not always a possibility, but when you can do that, it's helpful.
I just throw out there for all of you, I have a tool where I can build visual schedules. So if you guys would ever need or want any of those, like specifically, I'd be happy to like work with you, each of you individually, and we could build those together. I can print them out and mail them to you, or whatever that is. I can't remember the name of the app, but we have a program that we can use to do that.
That is awesome, because those programs are not cheap and they're so great and make it so easy. So that's great, yeah. Maggie. So I would highly encourage you to take Maggie up on that.
So just, really feel free to, you guys should all have my contact information, and we can do that.
Awesome. All right. And this is an example of a morning routine. This is really cool because it starts from the beginning, and as you do each step, you take something down. So for instance, you are making your bed, then you're taking that down, then you're getting dressed, you're taking it down and putting in the all done. And so they kind of know what's left, and it's really nice. So they can anticipate what's next and what's coming up. We have these all over the clinic and use them all the time. They're so incredibly helpful. Like I said before, we don't just transition because a timer goes off or it's 5 o'clock or whatever it is. And our kids want those same things too. They want to be able to prepare themselves. Here's another example of one for a child that's learning to get potty trained. So you can see, depending on the child and their developmental level, you might have to break it down into really specific steps. You can see for this child, you know, they're breaking it down into like unzipping the pants, standing in front of the toilet, going to the bathroom, zipping up the pants, where some kids may not need all those details, or maybe some kids need even more details. So when you're making your visual schedules with Maggie, you want to think about the developmental level of your child and really go through the steps with them and see how they do things and how they're thinking about it. As a part of orientation at Children's Hospital, when you become a new employee, they have us write down the steps for washing your hands. And, you know, I was like, oh, this will probably be like around like 12 steps. And so then at the end, we all like said how many steps it took us to wash our hands. There was everywhere from 5 steps to like 200 steps. So you can see that you can really break it down into specifics based on what's needed for your child and their developmental level. Oh, and social stories are my favorite. They're so fun. It's a written description of a social situation and the expected behavior that's going to happen. And a lot of times social stories are used for things that might be more difficult for children. So for instance, a lot of our children have a hard time coming to the hospital and seeing us for the first time. That can be really anxiety provoking. So what we'll do is create a social story. We'll show them a picture of the hospital in the parking lot, and then a picture of the waiting room, maybe a picture of their providers, and kind of what's expected of them as they go through those steps to make it a little bit easier. And it decreases the likelihood of challenging behaviors. Carol Gray is the person that created these, and you can go to her website and there's a bunch of social stories there, and it kind of provides you the framework for creating a social story. But when you're thinking of visual schedules or social stories, you want to think of where are things or areas where my child's having some difficulty? Where can I give them some help? And that's really where you want to use those things. And again, Pinterest is awesome. There's a ton of social stories on there about like sharing, using nice hands, all kinds of things. So this is an example of a social story of a child that's going into class for the first time. So when I go into class, I use a quiet voice, I have quiet hands, and as you can see here, they're telling the children what to do instead of what not to do. And again, you want to consider the developmental level of the child. This one on the left feels pretty feasible. There's not a lot of words on it, but there's still kind of some. So you might want to use more pictures for a child that maybe is a little bit lower developmentally. And then this next one, this has a lot of words, right? There's pictures with it, which is nice, but this is probably for a child that's a little bit higher developmentally. So again, just considering that when you're making these things. And I feel like, you know, whenever you're doing those, you always want somebody else to read them before you use them with your child. It's so interesting because I think as adults, we just kind of assume the way things go, and we have a lot of rules and social rules in our head that we forget that our children don't know. So I was making a social story for a child to teach them about trick-or-treating, because there was always a problem behavior with trick-or-treating. And so we wanted to teach the appropriate behavior. So I made this really nice social story with these nice pictures, and I was so excited about it. But then they went to go trick-or-treating. So they had read the social story, they went trick-or-treating. And one of the lights at one of the houses was turned off, and the child wanted to go there anyways and had a really big meltdown because they couldn't go there. And I had forgotten to put in my social story, like, you don't go to the houses where the lights turned off. And so again, it's just kind of like making sure you're going through all the steps and thinking about it from your child's point of view and having somebody read it, because maybe you're missing like something really important, like, hey, you can't go to that house because they likely don't have candy. So just thinking through those different things. All right, so we're going to move on from antecedent strategies and talk more about consequences. And when we talk about consequences, remember that really just means what happens after the behavior. I think a lot of times we think about, we think that consequences mean punishment, but that's not necessarily the case. It's just what happens after the behavior. And it's gonna, tell us whether or not to do that behavior in the future again if the function of our behavior was met. So if we got the thing that we wanted. And this is the most powerful part of the ABC chain because of that reason. So again, we always want to be thinking about the function of the behavior, because if we implement a consequence that isn't targeting the function of that behavior, it's likely not to work. So again, the key is really the function of the behavior. All right. I realize I've been talking for some time though, so before I get into this, does anyone have any other questions?
And I know you put a question out there. I figure maybe wait until see what she goes over talking about the consequence. You had a question about when would you say the consequence is a fail? How many times should we apply it before we say that we should look at another strategy? So I don't know if you're going to address that now or if you want to address it.
Yeah, you guys, I love the way that you're thinking. This is so awesome. That is a great question. So I'll talk about it later, but I just want to address it now because it's such a good question and I don't want to leave it lingering. A lot of times when we do or respond to behavior differently than what we have done in the past, we're going to see the behavior increase. They're going to escalate that behavior because if you think about it, if a child was yelling and screaming before to get your attention, and then that no longer works to get your attention, they're going to up the ante. And they're like, well, this worked for me before, so maybe I just have to do it a little bit more, right? So I'm going to yell and scream longer and louder, and they're going to do that a little bit more until they realize that's not going to work. So a lot of times, the behavior does get worse before it gets better. And so if you're seeing that, there's a couple things that could be happening. Your consequence could be working. Your behavior strategy could be working. And it's just getting worse before it gets better because they're upping that ante. They're like, why is this not working for me anymore, right? There could also be something that is maybe accidentally reinforcing that behavior in some way. So you want to keep an eye out for those. But most of the time when the behavior is getting worse, it's likely because the consequence is working and they're just kind of upping the ante. Great question. So really, when we're thinking about consequences, I've already kind of gotten into this a little bit. We want to think about a two-pronged approach. And so Maggie was really asking about this earlier. So we want to address the problem behavior and decrease the problem behavior by implementing a consequence that does that. But we also want to make sure that we're replacing the problem behavior with a more appropriate functional behavior. So the behavior that we want to see. So for instance, say a child is yelling and screaming to get your attention, and you ignore, they do it more and more. It's kind of like, it's getting worse before it gets better, and then it gets better and they finally stop screaming. Then you want to let them know the appropriate replacement behavior. So say they stop screaming and they say, Mommy, please can I have your attention? Not likely to happen exactly in that way, but you want to let them know, great job using your words. Thank you so much for talking so nicely. So you're reinforcing that replacement behavior, where instead of screaming and yelling to get your attention, they're using words and talking nicely to get your attention. So you want to make sure that you're doing both of those things, because a lot of times where behavioral strategies fail is when we're only addressing the problem behavior and not teaching new skills or replacement behaviors. All right.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Based on what you just said. So how can we implement, if you have a child that has limited speech and doesn't quite have the ability to do that, how can we get those positive reinforcements? Like, how can we get to that second part of the prong? I can't really, I don't know how to, does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. So are you thinking of, in that specific example, like my child is maybe going to yell and scream because they don't have words? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So what can you do with that to get them to do something that you want them to? And then how do you do that if they can't talk?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I love that you're thinking of the developmental level of your child and like what's appropriate for them, because that's really what's going to make the most effective consequences. I think in that case, as soon as they stop yelling and screaming, you give them attention. So as soon as they calm, great job calming. Thank you for standing there so nicely. So give attention to that, even if they're not saying or doing anything. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is teach them maybe more functional ways to get your attention. So, if they're not using words, that's totally okay, but maybe they can tap you on the shoulder, or, a lot of kids like to put up cards or something like that if they want attention. So thinking about things that you can praise and reinforce, that maybe they're not words, but maybe they're just calming. Like if they're calm, you want to reinforce that, or if they use any other strategy that's appropriate. Does that answer your question? Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so I hope it did. And we're actually going to get in.
Sorry, I forgot that I was mute. Yes, you answered my question.
It did? Is that what you said? Okay,
thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, you guys have such great questions. This is such a fun group. So we're going to actually talk about strategies and consequences for addressing attention-seeking behaviors. So it's already a lot what I've talked about. So you want to teach your child to request attention appropriately, whether or not that's with words. So, if it's with words, Mom, can you please listen to me? Or maybe if it's not with words, like patting you on the shoulder or waving their arm, something to let you know that they want attention. And then you want to ignore minor inappropriate behavior. So like we were talking about earlier, you can't ignore if they're destroying objects or hitting or, doing things that's going to be destructive, but anything else like whining or, being just like trying to annoy you, you want to ignore those minor misbehaviors, because that isn't really affecting anyone and you're kind of enduring the punishment, right? But it's going to teach them that that's not what gets your attention. And then you want to avoid, don't do that, or no, stop that, because then again, that gives them that attention that they want, even if it's negative attention. You can also kind of let your child know if they're having a hard time figuring out what to do. If you use your words, I will give you attention. Or if you pat me on the shoulder, I will give you attention. Again, this is a fine line, because you want to create space in between the problem behavior and the replacement behavior, but sometimes a child doesn't know what to do, right? So we kind of have to frame it for them and let them know what is appropriate in that situation. All right. So this is just talking a little bit more about when to ignore. So again, this is like annoying behavior, crying, whining, screaming, those kind of things. And I have a video, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to keep going because I have 30 more slides, so I want to make sure to get through them all. And then ignoring sounds like a lot of parents, I think it sounds like you're doing nothing or you're just being kind of complacent with their behavior, but it's actually the exact opposite. It takes a lot of energy to ignore a behavior that's annoying, right? It takes a lot of energy to be neutral in a situation that you are kind of feeling like revved up in because it's annoying. So when you're ignoring your child, you want to make sure that you're not making eye contact with them. You're looking away. You're being silent and very neutral. So even like making facial expressions like, oh my gosh, here they go, like that can really give them the attention that they want. And so you want to make sure that you're remaining neutral. Don't stop what you're doing. And again, you're ignoring the behavior, not the child. So you're staying near them. So as soon as they do something you want to see them do, like maybe they say, you know, can I please do this? And they ask you something nicely or use their words. Great job talking nicely. Thank you so much for using your words. So you're attending to the child. You're standing near them in case they do something you want to see, but you're ignoring that that behavior that's kind of annoying. I'm not gonna lie, I have a really hard time with this. I cannot ignore annoying behavior. And so I'll often have to like do something to distract myself. So sometimes I'll just like look at my nails, or maybe I'll look down at my phone to like try to keep myself neutral, because it is a difficult thing to do. And again, this is when not to ignore. Anytime it's physically unsafe, anytime they're being destructive, in those instances, you have to intervene. And you may even have to like block a behavior. But when you're doing that, you want to make sure that, as hard as it might be, that you're still remaining neutral. So for instance, say your child goes to hit you, you just put up your arm, just as neutral as that. No facial expressions. And I know that's really, really hard, but you don't want to make eye contact with them. You don't want to talk to them, because then you're giving more attention to that behavior. You just want to stop it from being harmful or destructive. So I actually had a kid the other day that was having a really hard time with the evaluation I was giving. And so he started throwing everything in the evaluation room. And so I couldn't let him do that. There's like computers and nice things around, and I didn't want him to hurt himself or anyone else. And so what I slowly started doing was just taking all the things out of the room. So I took the chair out of the room. Then I took the computer out of my laptop out of the room. So I was just slowly taking things out of the room, not making any eye contact with him, not talking to him because he was still actively throwing, but just making a more safe situation. Again, you want to ignore the undesirable behavior and praise the child the instant you see the behavior you want to see. So maybe as soon as, for instance, the child that I was seeing the other day, as soon as he calmed, great job calming. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for using your words, whatever it may be. And again, like you guys had already asked, expect the behavior to get worse before it gets better, especially when the function of the behavior is attention, because it's really easy to like ante up with that. Like, oh, I'm going to throw, or I'm going to get louder. So expect that to get worse before it gets better.
When you say expect it to get worse before it gets better, do you mean like in that moment, or over like a period of time, like days or weeks? Like is that what you mean? We just lost you. I can't hear you. Can you guys hear her?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so it's likely going to be both. So in that situation, it's going to get worse, and then maybe over time it might get worse too. But what you want to do is stay consistent and keep doing what you're doing, because you know that means it's working. Again, you do want to consider if there's something else that's maybe reinforcing that behavior, but try to stay as consistent as you can with the ignoring. And then the most important part.
Sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Are you?
Oh no, I can't hear you guys. Hold on.
Okay.
I'll put my headphones on.
You guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anne, were you talking?
Yes, I had a question.
Okay.
Further into your slides, are you going to get into or talk about different types of consequences and if they are appropriate or if they're not appropriate?
Yeah, so I don't get into specific consequences. I will talk about different strategies to use. I'm wondering if something is coming up for you specifically.
Yeah, okay, so my daughter goes to a babysitter and she uses timeout, and I'm not a really big fan. My daughter's 3. I'm really not I do believe in timeout for older kids once they have, I feel like I've taught this strategy and I know that they understand it and they're in like the mastery zone. Then I think that like sitting away and thinking about whatever I'm asking them to think about is appropriate. But I really feel like with children who are 3 and they still don't know what strategies they are, they don't know much. I don't know if I agree with that, but I really didn't have any research or anything to back it up. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were about timeout for a 3-year-old.
Yeah, I think that is such a good question. And I have a lot of different thoughts. And so my answer is going to be kind of vague, and I apologize in advance. I think the first thing is what you're already doing is thinking about the developmental level of your child. Can they really make the connection between I am getting a timeout because you know, I did something. And if they can't, then you kind of want to alter how you do that timeout or what it looks like. What I like to think of instead of like a timeout necessarily is that you're just removing all the things that are like reinforcing to them. So for instance, if a child is in the living room, you're removing all the toys, you're removing the TV is off. And so really anything that might be reinforcing or enjoyable in that moment is getting removed. I think the other thing is to consider is really like, what is the function of your child's behavior when they get a timeout, right? So if it's, you know, to escape a situation, like if she wants to get out of something, if he or she wants to get out of something, like maybe they're doing an activity at daycare, and then they get in timeout, that's actually going to be reinforcing to that behavior. And so I would agree with you that I don't think timeout is appropriate for every situation and, you know, for every child, but I do think that there is a good time and place for it. But again, it's considering the function of the behavior. And so I realize that's kind of a vague answer. I hope that helps you a little bit. But that is where a lot of behavioral strategies go wrong, is that they just use the same strategy for various different functions. And that's not helpful either, because we really want to address the function of the behavior. And do you have an example of maybe of what she's getting a timeout for?
Yes. So she's playing with, there were 2 times she was put in timeout 2 days in a row. The first day she was playing with a 2-year-old. I don't know, she didn't give me the situation that happened prior, but my daughter had a toy. The other little girl wanted the toy and took it from her, and my daughter hit her. And then the second situation the next day, it was the 5-year-old daughter, and my daughter and the 2 of them were playing, and she told me that out of nowhere, my daughter hit her or kicked her.
Mm-hmm.
And then she said when she was walking over to get my daughter, she kicked her again. But she didn't tell me what happened prior to that.
Yeah. So it's hard to know really what's going on. It sounds like maybe she's getting frustrated with sharing, and that, you know, that is hard for a 3-year-old. That is a confusing thing. I do think in that moment, it would be good to take away anything that is kind of enjoyable or reinforcing for her. So if doing like a timeout spot or something like that is helpful. However, since your daughter is 3, you want to consider the age of the child. And so they might not be able to tolerate even like a 2-minute timeout. Oftentimes they say do the number of minutes for the age of the child, which I feel like can be okay sometimes, but some children can't tolerate timeouts as much as other children. So you want to know what they're able to tolerate. And then I think what's really important about the timeout is letting them know why they get out. So say she's sitting there calmly and kind of just being on her own and using nice hands. Great job using nice hands, like your timeout is over, whatever it may be. So even if she's not fully understanding the connection in the moment, like over time, she's learning that that's the skill that you want to see to get out of timeout.
Okay, the second day she was in timeout, she said she put her in timeout for 6 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, you might just want to talk to her about it and just, you know, whatever it is that you guys do at home and that you notice that she's able to tolerate. And if she's not able to tolerate a 6-minute timeout and that kind of ends up making her behavior even worse because she's in there for 6 minutes, that might be difficult. So like I said, kind of like the standard rule that they use is the number of minutes for the age of the child, and that can be helpful, and sometimes that can't. So it just depends on your child.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that answered your question. And so, you know, again, like I was saying, you want to attend to the positive behavior. You want to reward it. Maybe that's with praise, but maybe that's even more than just praise. Maybe they get to do something really exciting, like they get to play with a special toy or watch a special video, whatever it may be. But making that connection for them, like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for using nice hands. Now you get to watch your favorite movie or whatever it is. So you're kind of narrating that for them and not just assuming that they know why they get to do that thing. And so what's so crazy about positive attention is that we know it's super powerful, but we tend to not use it as much as we're supposed to. So this ratio is saying 10 to 1. I think the more updated research is saying 4 to 1. So for every one kind of like negative comment or reprimand towards your child, you want 4 more positive statements or praises. So the ratio that you're really keeping in mind is 4 to 1. And that's not a perfect ratio either. I think what you want to know is you want much more positive reinforcement and praising and interactions than reprimands. And sometimes you know, if your child is having challenging behavior on a certain day or a certain week, you have to get really creative with finding ways to do that. So even if it's a behavior you already expect, you can praise them for that. But you want to make sure that that ratio is there. And that's letting your child know that, hey, there's a difference when I get this.
I lost you again. We lost your sound again. Huh.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
So weird. I don't know what's going on. This actually happened to a speaker. I watched their presentation the other day and I was like, what is this person doing? And now it's happening to me. So got to get this figured out. Thank you for letting me know, Maggie, though, that you couldn't hear me. Okay, so 10 to 1 ratio, 4 to 1. Basically just do much more positive attention than negative attention. And then you want to immediately praise the behavior that you want to see. If it's, you know, even a minute after you see the behavior, they're likely not going to make that connection. And especially because your children are younger, you want to make that connection right away so that they know, like, oh, the behavior that I did is connected to this praise that I'm getting right now. Yeah, so like I was saying, you want to reward or praise the behaviors that can't happen at the same time as the negative behavior. So if yelling is a problem, you want to praise them every time they are speaking normal. Or if hitting is a problem, praise them every time they're using calm hands and really letting them know that's the behavior you want to see. All right. I think you guys have probably heard me do some labeled praises, but it's really important to do labeled praises. And that just means you're telling them exactly what it is that you liked, because then, you know, if you just say good job or awesome, they might not know what you're talking about. So good job pointing to the apple, terrific work saying your name, I'm so proud of you for waiting your turn. So making sure that you're labeling exactly what it is that you're praising them for. All right. Do we have any questions? Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going for the purpose of time. So if a child wants to get something like the chicken nuggets, for instance, we have some strategies for that. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit too. So I so appreciate your guys' questions kind of teeing me up for these things. So you want to avoid giving the child the preferred item immediately after the problem behavior. So if, you know, Jack wants a piece of candy from the store when you're waiting in line and he's screaming and yelling to get it. If you give him that candy right away, that's going to tell him, oh, that behavior worked. You want to make some clear space in between the problem behavior and the appropriate behavior. If a child wants an activity that's not available, or something they can't get immediately, you want to let them know when they can get that thing, or redirect them to items that are available. All right. And then you want to teach your child to request preferred items. So maybe this is using words. Maybe it's like showing you the object. Maybe you put out a couple different options for them and they show you the thing that they want. But you want to make sure that you're teaching functional communication. So they're learning to request what they want and that you can know that. You also want to teach your child to wait. So first pick up your toys and then you can have your tablet. So those first then visual schedules can be really helpful for that as well. And I'm not going to pull up this video for the sake of time. But if anyone is interested in these videos, I'm happy to send them to you. These are some visual timers that we use. So I really, really like the one in the top middle, where it is showing, like it literally shows as the time gets less with the red going away. And so the child can visually see like, oh, my time is less, whether that's they have to do something like a task, like help pick up or put away their toys, or they're doing something preferred, like being on their iPad. But it's a way for them to prepare for the transition and know when the activity ends. Again, if you're going to use a timer or countdown of any kind, make sure that you're ready to transition as soon as that goes off, because it becomes meaningless if you don't transition when it goes off. Time timer is a really nice one. If you guys haven't heard of that, it can be really helpful. And then these are some strategies for escape. So you want to use reinforcement. So they're going to receive a small reward every time they do the thing or try to escape the situation that if they're trying to escape a situation, every time they stay in that thing or maybe do the activity that they're ignoring, they're going to get some reward. So just an example is when I do evaluations, sometimes children, can do a chunk of items and then they get a reward. Sometimes children need a reward after every item because that task is really hard for them and they really can't tolerate sitting there doing something that they don't like. So I will ask them a question, give them a piece of candy, ask a question, give a piece of candy. And sometimes a really nice way to do that is to have the reward right in front of them so they can see it. And, it's very visual to them. Like, I know that's what I get if I do this. And these are just a nice visual support, again, to use. And then for escape-related behaviors, you want to start small and easy and gradually increase the demand. So like I was saying, I was doing one item at a time, and then we were able to build up to like bigger chunks. So like 5 items at a time, then 10 items at a time. And you really kind of want to monitor how that's going and don't increase it too much if it's feeling like overwhelming. And then I think I've touched on this a little bit already too, but if the function of the behavior is to get out of a situation, you do not want to use timeout because that's going to reinforce that. They're getting what they want from that situation, right? So if they're yelling and screaming because they don't want to sit at the table and then you send them to timeout, that's going to reinforce yelling and screaming at the table when they don't want to be there. You also want to help teach them coping strategies for situations where it's kind of unavoidable to escape. So for a child that's in a really loud place, maybe they can wear headphones, or for a child that gets really nervous in new situations, maybe they have some breathing that they use, or some distraction techniques that you could use, like something that they really like bubbles or counting, whatever it might be. And then the sensory behaviors are a little bit harder to address, like I was saying earlier, because they do provide that like instant gratification. I think one thing that you want to do is if they are doing a sensory behavior, and especially if it feels like it's inappropriate, you don't want to overreact to the behavior. Again, you want to address these behaviors as calmly as possible. And you want to identify an appropriate time for the behavior to happen. Again, I know this group of children is a little bit younger, so that might be something to consider as they develop. But a lot of times with these, it's teaching more appropriate behaviors. So say a child likes to scream really loudly because that feels good to them. They like that noise. Well, what's something that we can do instead to really serve that function of some sensory seeking, but not be disruptive? Or maybe you teach them like, oh, you can sing and scream in the shower, but when you are at the dinner table or out in public, we can't do that. So you want to teach the child to request the alternative activity and reinforce that. So maybe instead of like jumping up and down and flapping their hands really loudly, which is completely fine in some situations, but maybe they need to be like waiting their turn in line or something. You want to teach them to use an alternative strategy. So maybe that would be like rubbing a fidget or doing some calming thing that they can hold in their pocket, whatever it might be, and really reinforce every time that they use that. It is a little bit harder for younger kids because I do feel like this work takes some thinking skills and like knowing when to request the alternative behavior, and knowing when to use the sensory behavior in appropriate situations. And so I think this is something to consider more as your children get older. For now, I think for the age group that you guys are in, what really your goal is to do is to distract them from that behavior. So a lot of times I'll have a bag of like fun things with me, whether that's bubbles or stickers, to distract from that behavior and kind of get them interested in something else. And then again, this is really that second prong of the two-prong approach. So we want to decrease the problem behavior, and then we also want to teach new behaviors. So really the idea of discipline, like I was talking earlier, is like not teaching on principle or like what's wrong or what's right. It's teaching them new skills and behaviors that are more appropriate and functional. So if you think about this, as much as I love doing my work and working with kids and talking to folks like you all, I might not do it if I didn't get a paycheck at the end, right? So if you think about your job, would you continue to go if you didn't get some kind of payout? And it's the same for kids, right? They need to be rewarded for their behavior. And, be told when they're doing a good job or doing the appropriate things. Reinforcement is really powerful, and that's why we do a lot of the things that we do. Oops, skipping around on my slides. The interesting thing about reinforcements, though, is they have to be motivating for the individual. So they are individual specific. For me, I am very motivated by food. So offer me like a chocolate chip cookie or cake and I will help you move your house. Like I'll do about anything for chocolate, but that might not be as reinforcing for some other people. So you really want to think about what is motivating for your child and what's going to get them to change their behavior. Maybe it's a drink. Maybe it's a certain activity. So like I was saying for my nephew, he loves construction. So anything related to dump trucks and diggers, he loves. So they got him to start wearing his underwear in potty training by getting him underwear that had dump trucks on it. So that in itself was reinforcing for him. So thinking about what's really motivating for your child. And you want to deliver that reinforcer immediately after the behavior that you want to see. Otherwise, the child's not going to make that connection. And you can let them know too, like you're getting this thing because you use nice hands or you use your words or you tapped me nicely, whatever it might be. The idea of reinforcers, though, is that you want to use them as children are mastering skills every time. So say your child is learning to say please and thank you. Every time they use please and thank you, maybe with your help or on their own, you want to reinforce that, whether it's with some kind of prize or some kind of praise, but letting them know that you like that. But as they're kind of starting to do that and you see them doing it on their own, like they're mastering that skill, you want to pull back that reinforcement because they don't need it as much. They're doing that skill on their own. And then what is the most powerful reinforcement is when you kind of get a prize or a reinforcer out of nowhere. So if you think about it, for us, if we get a bonus at work, like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. That was really reinforcing. Like, I'm going to do my job even better next time. And so that can be really reinforcing for children as well. So once they've mastered the skill, it's not that you can't provide praise or reinforce with a prize or something like that, but you want to do it intermittently and then kind of phase that out. Because children will get tired if you're reinforcing them every time they're doing something. And then also another thing to keep in mind is you don't want them to have unlimited access to the things that you're using as reinforcements. So maybe the iPad time is the reinforcer for your child, and that's what's really motivating for them. But if they're allowed to be on it most of the day, that's not going to end up being reinforcing for them. So you want to think about how much access they have to those things that you're going to use as reinforcers. And again, like I was saying, the reinforcement depends on the difficulty of the task and the person's motivation. The more difficult the task, the bigger the reinforcement. So for instance, if your child is not using any words and they use a word and say it correctly and use it on their own without any prompting, that's a really big deal. Like that gets a really big reward, right? So maybe that is an actual prize or a toy of some kind. But if your child is just doing something that's fairly easy for them and they're starting to master that skill, that's not as big of a task. So maybe that just gets praised. So you really want to think about matching the reinforcement to the behavior. Was it a really big behavior that was really, a challenge for your child to do, then that gets a big reward. Or reinforcement. If it was a smaller behavior, not that hard to do, that's a smaller behavior. So you really want the behavior to match the reinforcer to match the size of the behavior. And then avoid reinforcing negative or undesired behavior. That can happen, and it certainly happens. No one's perfect. It's going to happen, but just trying to avoid doing that as much as you can. And sometimes if you don't know what's motivating for your child, I'm assuming many of you do, you can ask them. Sometimes it's amazing the things that kids come up with, whether it's pointing to pictures that they like of toys or food. I had no idea what this one child liked that I was doing therapy with, and interestingly, we asked him about some things that were really motivating, and he really enjoyed wearing gloves, and like a certain kind of glove. Like it was a very sensory thing for him. Like that was very motivating, and I would have never known that. There are also reinforcement inventories out there, and so I know your children are a little bit younger, but if you just Google like a reinforcement inventory behavior, that can give you some ideas too. But again, reinforcement is not just a physical prize or thing that they want. It's also your praise and attention. All right. So as your children start to get a little bit older, they might really like these token systems. And these can be a nice way to help kids not need reinforcers every time and know that they're gradually building up to something. So maybe one token for each behavior, and they know they have a picture of what they're working for at the end of the token system, and then each time they fill in the green squares, they get closer to that thing that they're working for. So it's kind of increasing their tolerance of delayed reinforcement, which is a skill that you'll eventually want your children to build. Now, I know this is a younger age group, so they might not have those skills yet, but it's something to work towards. Maybe you just start off with like two green squares, and then they're working for something in the blue square. So maybe they have to do 2 different behaviors, and then they get the blue square, and then kind of increasing that tolerance so that they learn that consequences can be delayed, and they can still enjoy them. Again, consider the developmental level of your child and if that's appropriate. So you want to select the token, whether it's a sticker. It's really nice to have tokens that are super motivating for people. Identify the behavior so they know what they're supposed to do. Have like a menu of reinforcers, things that they can choose from. That can be really fun too. And then establish exactly when they're going to get it. Don't ever give a reinforcer if it's asked for, because that kind of defeats the purpose. Avoid battles or a confrontation around it. Make sure that they know exactly what they have to do to get it. So these are some more examples. These are probably for kids that are a little bit older, so you can still see they filled in like pennies and then they got computer time. But I want to be cognizant of time and know that we only have a couple minutes left. So wanted to check in and see if there are any questions. Okay. Looks like there's not any questions. I'm sure you guys are getting tired and hungry, and there's some antecedents to your behavior right now too. I want to leave you guys with some final thoughts. So like we've talked about already, the priority is making sure that everyone is safe. And if safety is a concern, like thinking about your plan if unsafe behaviors come up. Knowing the warning signs, and you can even with those emotion charts, have your children fill out maybe some of the warning signs and behaviors that they might do. We do have behavior treatment available through our department, Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, where you would work with a psychologist. So we are happy to do like one-time behavior consults, or we can do things that are a little bit longer. So if that's something that you're interested in, the number to call is 636-4611. And then the one-time behavior consults are 636-8107. And there's plenty of amazing community providers that are doing that work too. But I know sometimes once you start learning about behavior and these things, you want more and you want it specific to your child. Sometimes it's kind of hard to do these groups where things are a little bit more vague. And so if you'd like some more specific help, those would be really good resources as well. And then we have some information on our website about just different things with different resources for behavior and everything that's going on with COVID-19 and how that's affecting children and families. And so you can go to this website here as well for additional resources. And then I just wanted to say thank you guys so much. You were a wonderful group. Amy told me that you guys were awesome. And so it was really nice to hear your questions and see how thoughtful you guys were about these topics. And clearly you've been thinking about behavior for some time. We do have pretty typical outreach classes. So I don't know when our next one is coming up, but you can go to our website and look for those if you want more of this, and obviously contact Maggie if you have any questions. And then you guys also have my email if you have any questions about this specific presentation or anything that I talked about. And if you would please, I put in the chat an evaluation for this. We would so appreciate any feedback that you have. We're always looking to improve and be better, so I'd really appreciate it. That's all I have. Maggie, anything that you want to add, or anyone else have any questions?
No, I'll just make sure to follow up with you, Teresa, to get those different links and resources, and then I can send those to the class as well.
Hold on, I can't hear you, Maggie. This is so weird.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. It's
That's
the most
so
bizarre
funny.
thing.
Yeah, I was just saying I'll follow up with everybody to make sure I send all those links and like examples that were in the presentation that we didn't get to.
Sure.
And I'll just make sure if there's any follow-up, if they don't reach out to you directly, that I can get those questions to you as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, this was great. Thank you everybody for, coming on. I know it's always hard and evenings are hard, but I hope you guys all enjoyed this.
Yeah, and I appreciate your patience with my technology issues. So thank you, and you guys were an awesome group, and I hope you have a great night.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank you.
Awesome program.
Awesome. Take care, guys.
Okay.
Thanks for that positive reinforcement.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.